Good day, everyone. I'm Ezekiel Shurmeku. I'll be presenting our TSC paper titled Inputs from Hell, Learning Input Distributions for Grammar-Based Test Generation. This work was done while working at CISPA Center for Information Security alongside collaborators at Humboldt University Berlin. I'm currently at S&T University of Luxembourg. During software testing, developers are saddled with the task of generating appropriate test inputs to exercise the program. So for instance, creating appropriate JSON files to exercise a JSON interpreter written in Java and making sure that the expected output is observed. The main motivation of this work is that during software testing, the program or software may change, for instance due to refactoring or additional features being added. And when this happens, this means developers are tasked with the task of creating additional test inputs to exercise the program and exercise such changes. The fundamental question we ask during this process of creating additional test inputs is, what kind of features are we testing? Are we really testing the additional features that have been added or the changes? Typically, during software development, we resort to random test generation to create such test inputs. In this work, we want to instead focus on specific features. And the point is to be able to focus on features that are different from the initial test suites that we have in order to generate test inputs that are different and would exercise the changes that we have observed. To achieve this, we set out to achieve three different testing goals. The first one being generating common inputs. These are inputs that are similar to the initial test suite, for instance, and test the typical behavior of the program in order to ensure that the program is reliable. Secondly, we test for uncommon inputs. These are inputs that are different from the initial test suite and actually test for unexpected behavior and make sure that the program is robust. Finally, we want to generate failing inputs that may have caused failures in the past, similar inputs that are close or similar to the initial failing input in order to test for program failures. For instance, to make sure that a fix or a patch actually repairs the actual fault cause and not a symptom of it. To achieve this, we employ context-free grammars. Imagine or consider a sample arithmetic expression such as 1 multiplied by 2 plus 3 and a context-free grammar that defines the rules and the expected input elements that are allowed in an arithmetic expression. What we do is then actually parse this sample input to learn the frequency of occurrence. So for instance, we learn that digits 1 to 3 occur equally with a 3% probability, and operators multiplication and addition occur with a 50% probability. We then annotate the context-free grammar to form a probabilistic grammar. We annotate it with the distributions that we have learned, such that now those distributions are part of the grammar. The idea is to be able to then turn this grammar into a producer such that we produce inputs that are similar or that conform to this distribution that we have annotated. To give an example, again consider the same sample input. Using the process that I showed in the last slide, we learn a common usage and get a probabilistic grammar such as this. Then we turn this grammar into a producer and then we're able to generate common inputs. These are inputs that are similar to the initial sample. It have the same digits and the same operators. For uncommon inputs, what we instead want to do is invert this grammar such that we focus not on the features we have seen such as multiplication and addition, but now we focus more on subtraction and division. So we invert this grammar now to actually now focus on the other portions of the input elements that are seen. Then we turn this inverted grammar into a producer and generate inputs that are different from the initial sample inputs. So for instance, because it has different operators other than multiplication and addition. We implemented this approach and evaluated it with on a couple of subjects to give details. In our evaluation, we considered exceptions, program coverage, code coverage in terms of method calls, and the kind of failures that we induce and kind of inputs that induce such failures. We also performed our evaluation with three input formats: JavaScript, JSON, and CSS. and about 20 Java programs, including Mozilla Rhino and Google Closure Style Sheet. We set out to answer three major research questions. First is in terms of program behaviors. Do we induce a different behavior from the initial sample inputs when we run the common inputs, and vice versa when we run the uncommon inputs? What kind of bugs and exceptions do we trigger with this kind of inputs? And were we able to reproduce failures with our failure-inducing input approach? In terms of program behaviors, what we found was, in comparison to the sample input, our common input strategy, showed in the blue bars, actually triggered 94% of the call sequences that were covered by the initial samples, and our common input strategy triggered fewer. So basically, our approach actually covers similar behavior as initial test suite and less or different behavior as the initial test suite when using the uncommon input strategy. We also evaluated the kind of bugs and exceptions that were triggered. To do this, we collected thousands of files from GitHub and tested them on our subject programs. We collected about 15 different exceptions. We then also run our strategies like we did our common inputs by learning from benign inputs that do not cause any failures. And we're able to induce 2/5 of these exceptions that were found in the wild. And in addition, we actually found 8 new exceptions. So our approach is actually able to find lots of bugs, including bugs that are similar to reward, that are induced by reward files. Finally, we test for failure-inducing inputs. That is, if we learn from inputs that have caused failure in the past, can we reproduce exactly the same failures? We used about 14 exceptions that we had found in our corpus, and then we learned from the inputs that induced these exceptions and tried to generate the common input strategy for the failure-inducing inputs. We were able to trigger all of the exceptions. In comparison to the random generated inputs, none of these exceptions were triggered. In all of our runs, generating over 100,000 inputs per run, we found that 1 out of every 5 inputs triggered exactly the exception that we had learned. So triggered the exception that was induced by the initial failing input, and the rest triggered other exceptions that we have not seen before or are benign. So we triggered also 21 new exceptions that were not found by the initial samples or random generation. Our approach is limited by a couple of things. First, our inverse generation is limited whenever we learn a uniform distribution. So the inverse of a uniform distribution is a uniform distribution, so we tend to not generate uncommon inputs that are any different from the initial sample inputs if we have a uniform distribution for any of the production rules. We also do not learn the context of the input, so we don't know, for instance, if a bug is triggered by the ordering of the elements or the number of elements, then we will not be able to find this bug. And then finally, we also do not cater for input semantics, so we don't know if there are constraints on the input, if there is a particular value that is expected for a particular input. We actually don't learn this. So these are the limitations that we actually plan to improve in our future work. To summarize, I've showed you the main motivation for our work. We want to be able to learn common and uncommon features. I've also showed you our testing goals, the kind of research questions that we set out to evaluate, and some of the results that we have obtained. Thank you very much for listening. The paper was published at TSC, and all our data is available in the link shown.
Hi everyone, welcome to the session titled Testing Automatic Test Generation. My name is Jose Miguel Rojas and I will be your session chair. We have the pleasure to have Ezequiel Soremekum, I'm sorry if I botched your last name there, from the University of Luxembourg here with us. He is the lead author of the paper that you have just watched, Input from Hell, Learning Input Distribution from Grammar-Based Test Generation. This is a paper that was published in TSC last year, and he'll be very happy to take your questions. So how about we start with a question that Rahul has posted in the chat. What is the cost of ignoring the context in your approach?
The cost of ignoring context is that you tend to miss or not be able to induce the behaviors or bugs that involve contextual information about input elements. So imagine that you have a bug or a particular program behavior that is only induced when a particular number of input elements are followed or consecutively, or a particular sequence or ordering of input elements. Then you will not be able to induce such because our probabilities are tied to specific non-terminals or production rules.
I don't know if it makes any difference in your answer, perhaps not, but Rahul suggests, wouldn't it be better to incorporate the context into the generation? I assume the answer is yes, but yes, I'm sure you have a more elaborate answer.
The answer is yes, it's better because then you're able to capture more complex behaviors. And for instance, we have scenarios where you find a bug that is only triggered because you have a particular ordering of elements or a particular sequence of elements. And if you are able to learn such or the probability of such, then you will be able to trigger such behaviors. So definitely it will be better, and we are working on something to improve this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So for the audience, if you have more questions, please post them on the chat panel. And if you could also use the question mark icon, that it will be clear that what you're saying is a question. Perhaps I could push you a little bit on this same thought. So one of the interesting aspects of your evaluation is that you're very thorough in the evaluation of your results. I like that very much. In particular, the results you propose for your research question 1, that is kind of a sanity check, I believe, say that the variance in the input that you use to derive these probability distributions and the size of the input doesn't matter too much. So I think that's the main result of research question 1, right? So if size and diversity doesn't matter much, then wouldn't that put you very close to basically random probability distributions? You could assign any values, and what you're saying in RQ1 is that the results could potentially be the same?
No. So maybe I'm a bit, so to clarify, RQ1 is about common inputs and if we induce the same behavior as the initial samples we learned from. So I think the question you're talking about is our sensitivity analysis, where we try to analyze if the initial size of the input of the sample inputs we learned from. So what's the difference if we learn from 1 input or 5 or 10 or 50 inputs? And then also, what's the difference if we learn from a random set of initial seeds, not the same set of inputs? And we did this to be able to explore if our approach is sensitive to both parameters. And what we found is it's actually not so sensitive, in the sense that the variance does not matter. Whether you learn from 1 input or you learn from 5 or 10 or 20 inputs, you kind of see exactly the same behavior, in the sense that you induce the same behavior as the initial sample input for common inputs, and you induce different behaviors for uncommon inputs. So this is what we try to show in this experiment.
So if I can follow up on that. So if you only have 1 input and you have, let's say, 5 groups to which you have to assign a probability, right? And you only have 1 input that falls into one of those 4 or 5 groups, then what values do you assign for the probability?
So when you say groups, you mean the groups of the input element? So
yes,
if you've not seen a particular alternate or optional rule, then you assign a probability of 0 to it. It means you've not seen it. But there could be better ways, maybe dampening this or just assigning a probability of 1 to it, in the sense that you are saying, so imagine that you have the same example I gave in the presentation, right? You have 4 operators, you've seen addition and subtraction, but you've not seen multiplication. Then you assign a probability of 0 to multiplication, and you assign a probability of 50 and 50% to addition and multiplication. So in the uncommon input strategy, you then focus on trying to generate the division or subtraction that you have not yet seen in your initial sample inputs.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. Rahul has another question. How would the approach compare to approaches like Langfus, which ignores the probability in the grammar but uses fragments instead?
The difference to Langfus, I would say, is Langfus is more random, right? So we compare to a random approach. And the problem with a random approach is you might not be able to induce exactly the same behavior as in your initial sample input. So you're really not learning anything in a way, right? Because if imagine that I have a corpus of inputs that have induced failures in the past, or I've covered a particular program behavior. Let's say I've achieved 20% coverage and I want to achieve more coverage or new coverage, for instance. Then what we are able to do is learn the probabilities of the distribution of those input elements to avoid that and kind of improve the corpus, or to reproduce that in a way to, for instance, test for failures. So Langfors, my understanding of Langfors, I think from Christian Oller, is that it doesn't induce or actually introduce probability, so you cannot learn such distributions. And then it's mostly random. So if it's random, then you wouldn't learn that a particular input element should be generated, like you should generate addition and subtraction and ignore the other ones, for instance.
Great. Thank you very much. Rahul, feel free to follow up in case you want to follow up. We have another question from Paul Robinson. Is it correct that the test input grammars and the probabilities must be defined manually? Are there any tools to help in producing this?
So this is not done manually. So basically what we have is we are using Antler, the Antler parser generator. And what we have is basically we've created a grammar where you now annotate or add the probabilities as some form of semantics to the alternative rules of the grammar. So you can do this with Antler, because what Antler does is when Antler is passing, you can just have a counter that basically counts the amount of times you see a particular production rule. So when you've done this counting, then you can automatically normalize it to get the probability distribution. So I don't know if this is clear. So we basically use the Antler parser generators for this. So we convert the typical JSON grammar to a counting grammar, which is a grammar that is basically taking the same thing but adding semantic predicates that basically keep track of tracking when you pass the input file. And this is just like I've seen addition plus 1. So the count of addition becomes 1 instead of 0. I say I've seen addition again, then you increment it like that until you are done passing all inputs or all initial seed inputs.
Thank you very much. So of course your approach is applied into what you define as grammar-based test generation, right? Okay, before I go to that next question, I'll follow up because Paul is asking. So you're instrumenting the program under test in order to determine these probabilities?
No, actually. So we are actually passing the input itself. So imagine you take a sample JSON input or a sample arithmetic expression, and you have an input grammar that actually defines the allowed production rules. What you do is with Antler, you can generate a parser that takes that input, a parser that basically conforms to those grammar rules and can parse this input and then determine what input elements in this input are present in this grammar. So what production rules. And that way you can keep track of the production rules that you have seen when parsing that input. So I don't know if you know about the Antler parser generator project, but what it does is
sorry, Ezequiel. What I would suggest, because we don't have much time left for this Q&A, what I would suggest is that Paul follows you to your discussion room.
Okay.
A link will pop up in the interface in 20 seconds, and then perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more and perhaps share your screen with him. Thank you very much, Ezequiel. Very nice paper, very nice presentation as well. And to everyone, I'll see you in 10 minutes after our second paper presentation, which is titled Automatic Unit Test Generation for Machine